Wyoming Territory. August 1873, the sun burned high over the sagebrush as the wagon creaked alone on the trail near the Wind River Range, its rear wheel half buried in dust. Inside, a woman sat slumped against a stack of empty crates, her lips cracked, her brown hair matted to her forehead. She had not eaten in 3 days. Her name was Marabeth Zeller, and she had been left behind with nothing but a threadbare blanket and a tin can she had already scraped clean. Her kin had driven off without her at dawn, the last words from her cousin's mouth still stinging in her ears. "You're more trouble than you're worth." They had taken the horses. They had taken the food. They had taken her 2-year-old son, Zion. Marabeth could barely move. Hunger had made her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow. She had screamed herself hoarse that morning, her voice echoing across the plains like a dying bird's cry. Nobody came, until the sound of hooves broke the silence. A lone rider appeared over the ridge, the sun a halo behind him. Dust clung to his boots and coat, and his shadow stretched long beside him. He pulled up when he saw the wagon. He dismounted with slow care and walked toward it, one hand near the revolver on his hip but not drawing. His eyes scanned the wagon, then landed on her. "Ma'am," his voice was low, rough with trail dust but not unkind. "You hurt?" Marabeth blinked, her throat too raw to speak. The cowboy stepped closer, squinting. He had dark hair, sun-browned skin, and a scar running down his left cheek. He looked to be in his late 20s. "You alone out here?" She nodded, barely. That was all it took. He climbed up into the wagon without another word, pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, coughing at first, then easing into long gulps. When she finally looked at him full on, her voice cracked. "They left me, took my son, said I slowed them down." His jaw tensed. "You got a name, Marabeth Zeller?" He nodded once. "Brayden Ashford." The name suited him, strong, steady. Like the way he moved, like the way he looked at her without pity. "I will get your boy back," he said. "But first, you eat." He climbed down and came back with a strip of jerky and half a biscuit. She took them with trembling hands. He turned his back to give her privacy, and she felt tears roll down her cheeks as she chewed. The food was dry and plain, but it was more than she had dared hope for. When she finished, she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Brayden looked over his shoulder. "Because no one should be left like that, and because I meant what I said. You will never go hungry again." She stared at him, stunned. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with certainty, not with care. He nodded toward the trail. "Tell me everything you remember about who took your boy." Where they were headed. It took her a while to piece it together. Her cousin's name was Lyle, a bitter man with a mean streak. He had been driving their small party toward the Montana border, hoping to settle near Bozeman. Marabeth had argued with him the night before she was left. She had told him Zion needed rest. He had told her she was slowing them all down. Brayden listened without interrupting. When she finished, he helped her from the wagon. "We'll ride together," he said, unfolding a bedroll on the ground. "You need a night's rest." "I'll keep watch. What if they come back?" "They won't. But if they do, they'll answer to me." He said it so quietly that it chilled her. That night, under a sky thick with stars, she lay on the blanket while Brayden kept the fire low and his rifle nearby. She watched him from the corner of her eye. A man like him did not seem to belong in this world, too solid, too decent. Sleep took her slowly. But before it did, she whispered, "Thank you." Brayden glanced over. "Get some rest, Marabeth," and for the first time in days she did. By morning, her strength had returned enough to sit upright on the horse behind him. They rode at a steady pace, following the wagon tracks north. The trail was harsh, dry creek beds, rattlesnakes, cracked earth, but Brayden never wavered. He checked her wound where her ankle had twisted days earlier. made sure she drank enough water, and shared every bite of food evenly. He never asked for anything in return. They rode in silence most of the time, but it was not empty. It was a kind of understanding. On the third day, she asked, "Why do you care what happens to Zion?" Brayden looked ahead for a long moment. "Because my ma died when I was 3. My pa left me behind with a neighbor and never came back. I know what it means to be taken from the one who loves you." She looked down at her hands. "I am afraid he thinks I gave up." Brayden's voice was quiet. "Then we show him you did not." They found Lyle's wagon circle on the fourth morning, camped beside a bluff near a dried-up riverbed. Brayden stopped just short of the ridge and slid down, helping Marabeth dismount to crouch beside him. "There," she whispered, pointing. "That is our wagon. Zion, he sleeps in the back sometimes with the quilt." Brayden nodded. "Stay here." "No," he turned to her. "I want to be the one he sees when he wakes," she said, her voice shaking. "I want him to know I came." Brayden looked at her for a long moment, then handed her the smaller revolver from his saddlebag. They moved at dawn when the camp was quiet. Brayden flanked left, circling to distract the guards. Marabeth crept forward, heart pounding, breath tight in her throat. She slipped into the wagon and found him asleep under the quilt, his small chest rising and falling. Her hands trembled as she touched him. "Zion," she whispered, his eyes fluttered open. "Mama," his voice was soft, unsure. "Yes, baby, I am here." He burst into tears. A shout rang out outside, then a shot. Marabeth grabbed him, pressing his face to her shoulder. "It is okay. He is here. He will keep us safe." And Brayden did. She saw him drag Lyle from his saddle, fist to jaw, until the man lay groaning in the dirt. Then he turned and looked toward the wagon. They locked eyes. It was done. Later, as they rode away from the camp with Zion cradled between them and the wind brushing past their faces, Brayden spoke. "You and him. You are safe now." She leaned into his back, clutching her son and the man who had brought him back. And for the first time she believed it. She would never go hungry again. They kept west along the Bighorn foothills, where the cottonwoods grew sparse and the grass turned brittle underfoot. Brayden led them slowly, his eyes always scanning the horizon for movement, his hand resting lightly on the reins. Marabeth rode beside him now. Zion nestled in front of her on the saddle, quieter than usual, his small fingers curled into the wool of her shawl. The boy hadn't spoken since they left Lyle's camp. His silence clung to her more tightly than fear had. But she didn't press him. She wrapped her arms around him and followed Brayden's lead. By the fifth day, the land began to soften, streams threading through low valleys, cottonwoods thickening, and the air turning cooler in the evenings. Brayden slowed when they reached a narrow rise above a creek-fed basin. "There's a place not far," he said. "Old homestead I knew belonged to a man named Fowler. He died last winter, cabin still standing." Marabeth glanced sideways. "You sure it's empty?" He nodded. "Ain't been anyone around since. I checked in spring, hoping to plant something there, never got around to it." She didn't ask why. Some things were better left untouched until a person was ready to offer them. When they reached the cabin, the light was fading. The roof sagged in places, but the stone chimney stood firm and the door still latched. Brayden swung down first and lifted Zion from the saddle before helping Marabeth dismount. She didn't hesitate when he handed her the boy, just nodded and carried him inside. The air held the scent of old wood and dust. A single cot stood against the back wall and shelves lined one corner, mostly empty. Marabeth set Zion down gently, tucking a folded coat beneath his head. He didn't resist. Brayden worked outside for a while, chopping kindling from a downed pine near the woodpile. She watched him through the window, the way his shoulders shifted with each swing, the way he paused every few minutes to stretch his back. When he finally stepped inside, his hands were raw, but his eyes were steady. "You rest," he said. "I'll keep fire tonight. I can take a turn." He shook his head. "Tomorrow, maybe. Tonight you sleep." She didn't argue. She settled Zion more comfortably on the cot and pulled her shawl over them both. The warmth of the fire reached her slowly, but it was Brayden's quiet presence nearby that eased her to sleep. The next morning, Zion stirred. Marabeth felt him shift, then lift his head. "Mama," her voice caught. "I'm here." He sat up, blinking at the unfamiliar walls. "Where's the horse man?" Brayden stepped in just then, carrying a tin plate with biscuits and a few slices of dried apple. He set it by the hearth without speaking, then crouched beside the fire to stir the embers back to life. Zion stared at him. "You gonna stay with us?" Brayden didn't answer right away. He glanced at Marabeth as if asking permission. She nodded. "If you want me to," Brayden said finally. Zion nodded solemnly and reached for a biscuit. Later that day, Brayden led them down to the creek. The water was cold and clear, edged with willows. Marabeth knelt to wash their clothes on a flat stone while Brayden helped Zion gather smooth pebbles from the bank. The little boy had begun to speak again soft things, mostly questions, and Brayden answered each one with the same quiet patience he gave to the horses. As the sun dipped low, Marabeth wrung out the clothes and laid them across the brush to dry. Her skirt clung damply to her knees. She sat back on her heels and watched the two of them together. "You're good with him," she said. Brayden looked up from where he squatted beside Zion. "Don't know that I am, but I mind him. That's the start, I reckon." She stood and walked toward them, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. "You think we could stay here?" she asked. "Longer than a night or two." "I think you could do more than stay," he said. "You could make it yours." She looked out across the basin. The land was rough but not unkind. There was a small clearing behind the cabin. Enough for a garden, maybe even a goat or two. It didn't feel like a place meant for passing through. "You'd help me." "I already am." Marabeth felt the words settle in her chest like something rooted. She hadn't asked him to promise anything. But he had already begun to build something around them, not with declarations, but with action. That night, she brought in a pail of creek water while Brayden whittled a latch for the door. Zion lay curled in front of the fire, cheeks flushed with warmth, breathing slow and deep. "You ever have land of your own?" she asked. Brayden paused, knife in hand. "Had a claim once, north of here. Lost it to flood 3 years back. Never tried again." "Why not?" he shrugged. "Didn't see the point, just me alone." She stepped closer. "And now," he looked at her then, really looked. "Now I see something worth building for." Marabeth didn't reply. She didn't need to. The way she reached for the latch he'd carved and fitted into place said enough. They didn't touch. They hadn't yet. But something had shifted between them, not sudden, not loud. Just a shared knowing. Outside, the wind rustled through the dry grass and whispered against the walls. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The frost came in early September. Not heavy, just a silver dusting across the tops of the grass at dawn, but it settled into the cabin with a quiet finality, like a season turning its face. Brayden had already begun stacking wood against the north wall, using the dry pine he'd felled 3 days earlier. Marabeth watched him from the garden plot, where she was pulling the last of the turnips from the earth with bare hands. "You think that frost's sticking?" she asked, brushing dirt from her knuckles. Brayden straightened, held his hand palm up to the wind, then nodded once. "Won't be long now." First snow usually rides in behind the third frost. She tied the turnips into a bundle with the hem of her apron and stood. "We'll need more salt, and something for Zion's boots. His toes were cold this morning. There's a trader runs through Red Bluff Creek every other week. I could ride out tomorrow, be back by nightfall if the weather holds." "You trust him?" "I don't trust most folks," he said, "but he don't cheat, and he don't ask questions." She nodded and turned toward the cabin, where Zion was inside stringing pine cones onto twine. His hair had grown past his ears, curling along the back of his neck. Marabeth had been meaning to trim it, but he liked it long, and she hadn't the heart to take scissors to it. That evening she boiled the turnips with a handful of dried beans and a pinch of wild thyme she'd gathered near the creek. Brayden ate quietly, elbow resting on the table, eyes flicking now and then toward the window. "You expecting something?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just listening." After Zion was asleep, curled with the quilt tucked tight around him, Brayden stepped outside to check the horses. Marabeth followed, pulling her shawl tighter across her shoulders. The moon lit the clearing in a pale wash, and the air had the bite of the mountains in it. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. "Not anymore." She turned to look at him. "Why not?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze moved over the trees, the slope of the ridge, the faint smoke curling from the chimney. "I spent 5 years moving," he said. "Looking for something that felt like it might hold. Most of it didn't. This does." She stepped closer, not touching him, just standing beside him with her eyes on the dark. "What did you do before all that? Cowpuncher, trail hand, broke horses for a while out near the Powder River. Tried freighting supplies between camps, but the wagon busted outside of Green River and I never got it right again." "You ever want more?" He looked at her then, and his voice was quieter than before. "Yeah." She didn't move. "What kind of more?" Brayden took a breath, like he might leave the words unsaid. Then he tipped his head toward the cabin. "Something that don't run. A roof that stays nailed down. A boy learning to throw stones into the creek. A woman who don't flinch when she looks at me." "I don't flinch. I know." They stood together a long while. The horses shifted in the corral, and a whip-poor will called from the trees. When they went back inside, Marabeth knelt to stoke the fire while Brayden latched the door. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He laid his coat aside and sat on the floor across from her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "I ain't asking anything from you," he said. "Not until you know what you want." "I know. I'm not a man with much to offer. You offered me everything when you found me." Brayden lowered his gaze. "I just didn't want you to die, and I didn't," she said. He looked up then, and something passed between them that wasn't heat but something steadier. Something that would last when the fire burned down and the cold crept in. She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just turned his palm so their fingers wove together like it had always meant to be that way. Outside, the frost thickened on the windows. Inside, the silence between them was full. The morning Brayden set out for Red Bluff Creek. Marabeth stood beside the gate and watched him adjust the cinch on his saddlebag. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the ground was still cold beneath her bare feet. "I'll trade for salt, boots, and a skein of thread if he's got it," Brayden said, tying off the flap. "If I'm not back by dark, wait 2 days. If I'm still gone, ride west till you hit the river and follow it north. There's a widow with a mill house. Her name's Bernice. You think you'll need a place to send us?" Her voice came quiet but steady. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm just done leaving things to chance." Zion peeked around the doorframe, wrapped in the wool coat Brayden had let him wear through the cold snap. "Will you bring me a button too? A round one?" Brayden crouched, resting a forearm on his knee. "If he's got one, it's yours." He rode out without ceremony, just a glance back and a lift of his hand. The horses' hooves faded into the trees, and then it was only the wind again. Marabeth spent the day straightening the shelves inside the cabin, sorting the last of the dried herbs and patching a tear in Zion's trousers. She worked without rush, without worry, the kind of calm that had taken root slowly, like moss along stone. Every so often, Zion brought her something a feather, a crooked stick, a rock shaped like a tooth, and asked if they could keep it. She said yes to each one. As the light thinned, she lit the oil lamp and pulled the curtain across the window. Zion fell asleep with the coat still draped over him, his hand curled around the string of pine cones they hadn't finished hanging. Outside, a coyote called long and low. She listened for hoofbeats until sleep pulled her under. He returned the next afternoon. She heard the horse before she saw it, the rhythm of the gait uneven, not from injury but burden. She stepped onto the stoop just as Brayden crested the rise, the pack behind his saddle bulging with supplies. A second horse trailed behind, roped at the bridle. "Borrowed this one from the trader," he called, dismounting. "He's heading north next week, said I could ride it back to him if I bring a sack of flour." She approached, relief settling through her in a way that surprised her, not fear shed but something steadier, like belonging. Brayden dropped the pack at her feet. Salt, boots, thread, and a button. She raised an eyebrow. "You found one." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small linen pouch. Inside was a smooth wooden button carved with a starburst pattern. "Traded a knife for it," he said. "Figured the boy'd like something worth keeping." She turned the button in her hand. "Thank you." Brayden looked toward the cabin. "Everything all right here?" "Well enough. He missed you, though." "I missed him too," he said, then added more quietly, "And you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped aside so he could pass, then followed him in. Zion sat up the moment Brayden entered, his eyes lighting as he spotted the pouch. "You really got it?" Brayden nodded and knelt beside him, placing the button into his palm. Zion turned it over once, then tucked it into the coat pocket like it was gold. That evening, they shared boiled potatoes and pan-fried cornmeal cakes. Brayden's hands were scraped from the ride, and Marabeth rubbed salve into the raw skin without speaking. He didn't flinch when her fingers brushed his wrist. After Zion was asleep, Brayden sat by the hearth, sharpening the blade he had left. Marabeth moved to the table and laid out the thread and cloth. "You ever think about marrying?" she asked, her voice even. He didn't look up. "Only when it stopped feeling like something I'd never deserve." "And now," Brayden set the whetstone down and met her gaze, "now I think I'd ask, if I thought the answer was yes." She folded the cloth slowly. "Would you ask now?" "Not unless you're ready to answer." She crossed the room and knelt beside him, her hands resting lightly on his knee. "Yes." He didn't speak, didn't move, just let the words settle between them like a stone in still water. Then he reached for her hand and laced their fingers together, the calluses on his palm catching gently against hers. The fire popped behind them, and outside, the wind stirred the trees. He leaned in, slow as dawn, and touched his forehead to hers. "I meant it," he whispered. "You'll never go hungry again." She closed her eyes. "I know." And she did. The wedding took place 3 weeks later beneath the cottonwoods that arched along the creek bend. The leaves had begun to yellow into the first hints of fall, and the mountains stood quiet in the distance, dusted white at their peaks, but still holding back the season's full weight. Brayden wore his cleanest shirt, sleeves rolled at the forearms, and Marabeth stitched a blue ribbon through her braid that Zion had found in a chest tucked deep in the cabin's loft. They spoke their vows aloud, just the three of them standing in the hush of the morning. Brayden folded her hands in his and said, "Whatever comes, I'll meet it beside you," and Marabeth answered, "We'll build everything with these hands." Zion held a bunch of wild asters and gave them to his mother with both arms stretched. There was no preacher, just the land and the promise made. That evening, Brayden lit a lantern and hung it from the porch beam. The glow reached only a little ways, but it was enough to turn the clearing gold. He brought out the fiddle he'd bartered for during his last trip to Red Bluff Creek, a worn thing. strings still strong, and played a tune that started low and slow, then lifted into something that made Zion tap the porch with his heel. Marabeth laughed, pulled her son into a circle, and danced with him until his legs gave out and she carried him inside. Later, she returned alone, wrapped in the same shawl she'd worn the day Brayden found her, now mended along the edges with dark brown thread. He stood near the corral, rubbing down the gelding. The horse nosed his hand, then turned toward the trough. Marabeth walked to him, her boots soft in the grass. "There's something I didn't tell you." Brayden set the brush down. "You don't owe me confessions. I want you to know. My family, before Leo, my folks were tenants in Missouri. My father died the winter I turned 17, and my mother passed the next spring. After that, I followed whoever had room in a wagon. I lost track of how many times I was told I didn't belong." Brayden didn't move, just watched her face. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere. I never thought someone would ask me to." He stepped forward and took her hand, calloused fingers curling over hers. "You're not passing through," he said. "Not anymore." She leaned into his chest and he wrapped his arms around her. They stood that way until the lantern flickered low. Neither of them hurried the moment. In the weeks that followed, the cabin changed shape. Brayden added a second room off the back for Zion. Using split boards he scavenged from the abandoned mill farther up the ravine. Marabeth built shelves in the kitchen nook and lined them with jars of berries and wild mint. Zion carried stones from the creek and laid them in rows along the path to the garden, marking each one with blue chalk for luck. Brayden taught Zion to whittle. Marabeth showed him how to mend small tears in his shirts. He asked questions about the stars, about why leaves turned, about whether rabbits dreamed. They answered each one without hurry. One morning, snow fell soft as flour dust. Zion pressed his hands to the window, wide-eyed. "Will the garden come back?" he asked. "In spring," Marabeth said, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. "Everything sleeps a while first." Brayden stepped behind her, arms curling around her waist. "We'll keep it warm through the cold." They spent the winter together in rhythms that felt like breath. Brayden chopped wood in the early hours, and Marabeth baked cornbread in the cast iron pan he'd salvaged from Fowler's barn. Zion learned to read from a book of parables she found in the bottom of a chest. At night, she read aloud by the fire's glow while Brayden carved small animals from cedar scraps, hands always steady. They never spoke of the road behind. Not because it hurt, but because the life they were making took all their attention. It was not a grand thing, but it was whole. Every day built something new between them, a habit, a touch, a word left unsaid but understood. In late March, when the frost finally broke, Brayden planted potatoes in the thawed soil behind the cabin. Marabeth watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly. He looked up. "You sure?" She nodded once. "It's early, but yes." He walked to her without a word, knelt, and pressed his ear gently to her stomach. Then he kissed the place just below her ribs. Zion came out with a bundle of carrot seeds and said, "Can I plant beside Pa?" Brayden looked up. "You can plant wherever you want, son." The air smelled of damp earth and the first edge of green. They had everything they needed. A cabin warm in winter, a garden readying for spring, a boy with a steady hand and a full heart, and a future that stretched quiet and sure as the ridgeline beyond their trees. Together they stayed. Not because they had to, but because they had found where they belonged, and they were happy. Always.